Yeah, so look, when we talk about these terms right and left, they're incredibly gross, incredibly broad. Uh, because look, I consider myself a man of the right, full stop, but I realistically have almost nothing in common with Marjorie Taylor Greene. I don't particularly like her or really what she represents. But I will say, I think that both the Republican and the Democratic Party, if we can consider those as broad blocks, right? Again, not ultimate specificity, but something we can use to jump off of. We're seeing in each group a massive generational war. And across those generations, right, the young and the young, the old and the old, there are certain issues which we're actually relatively aligned on. Now, does that end politics? Not at all. Man is a political animal. There's really no way getting around that. But particularly as it regards a certain Middle Eastern nation, I realize you're on a strike, Paul, so I'll talk around this. Our relationship to our closest foreign ally, but also on the economics front. You see very few young right wing men making Milton Friedman style talking points, talking about the need for sort of Reaganite economics. And I think that there is room for a synthesis on along those lines. Now, I do think when I look at the, shall we say, the young left, as broadly as we can constitute that, I think there is a messaging problem to look at it uh, charitably that is creating the rise of white identity politics, which is it's very difficult for me to answer the question of what can I be as a young white man on the political left? Like what role can I step into that has a certain amount of dignity? Uh, I think that is harder to bridge, regardless of if I feel that a sort of a nascent white identity is a good thing or a bad thing. It seems to me that it is being created. Now, again, like we said, it's possible to come up with sort of a new political order, right? Where there are new issues up for debate, whereas others are pulled back from. We sort of shift into a different Overton window. And that well could be positive. But I think really this comes down to, well, who do we consider to be the left and the right? And what is I guess, the acceptable area of play? Like what is within the realm of acceptable politics? Because I think that, if we, and both sides have sort of sunk into existential language, right? You hear people, screeching about genocide, they want to kill us. And it's possible to move past that. Like it's possible to get to a position where we neither countenance those sort of statements or those threats. But it requires, I think, it requires good faith on both sides. And the problem is that sort of rhetoric, right? That existential rhetoric is very powerful and very useful for politicians. And so when we say, is it possible to form some sort of synthesis between the right and the left? In an academic sense, certainly. And there have been times, particularly in the early 20th century, where, a revolutionary right wing sort of political framework pulled from both, the Marxian left and kind of an ethno nationalist right. And that was politically successful, regardless of what eventually came of those societies. So it is academically possible. Is it feasible? I think is another question, and I'm perhaps more pessimistic on that front.
Okay, because it just seems so clear to me that there's so much economic discontent. There's so much acknowledgement that we live in like basically a techno feudal system where the people at the ultra rich who have, control over the means of artificial intelligence now are accumulating all the wealth inequality is skyrocketing. This is why you have the Luigi Mangionis and whatnot. On Israel, there's unity on the left and right in terms of U.S. tax dollars should not be going to a foreign country that is not providing us any advantage. And if anything, is making us worse in different ways. So along those, to me, the feasibility is along those two dimensions. You have a lot of feasibility right there, but you don't see it that way.
Well, it's not to say that there is a niche to be found there, but is there an existing political framework to accommodate that? because I mean, look, right? You see this, and I assume similar conversations have to happen on the left, Victor. I just don't know that space as well. But you see from figures like Ben Shapiro, from figures like Dinesh D'Souza, a constant desire to reframe current issues in the language of the 70s and 80s. So, for instance, like, why do you care about Israel when Venezuela is a socialist dictatorship? It's like, is it? Why does that matter to me? That feels incredibly out of date because, one, that is a comfortable place for them. They want to exist there. And at least on the right, and again, I will assume that this is a mirrored relationship, there is a desire to sort of salami slice off the next generation, right? We would rather have our old pundits, our old political figures we can keep around forever than bring in new blood. Because for those people at the top, why do they want to retire? You can become Dan Crenshaw or Nancy Pelosi wealthy. Why would you ever retire? Uh, Similarly, I think there's another dimension to this as well, which is effectively, look, there's a certain degree to which certain factors of the economy are a zero sum game. So, for instance, as regards housing, baby boomers are incredibly wealthy and incredibly powerful, both in electoral sense. They control a lot of votes, they vote at higher rates, and an immense amount of their wealth is held up in housing. It is an asset that will both fund their retirement, which enables them to continue to stimulate the economy, but also it keeps them from overdrawing on government programs which are already financially insolvent. And so effectively, there is no real incentive to solve that problem while baby boomers are as powerful as they are. So again, when I say, like, is there a desire? Yes. Will that desire be met by politicians? Potentially, yes, but I don't see it happening anytime soon because their priorities and your priorities, our priorities, whatever you want to constitute those, are not the same.
That's fair. Well, this is in part why the Dark Centrist Project needs to be bootstrapped. But Victor, I don't know. Do you have thoughts in terms of? Do you think there's a clear path to a synthesis between the right and left on issues that matter, or what are you thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's like a lot to react to there, and like a lot of questions are sort of raised for me in terms of terminology and also what we mean by different things. But I guess broadly, I mean, like sort of putting some of my cards on the table. I guess I just the place in which I think there could be, I guess, some sort of unity is like looking at the root causes of like why there's so much economic anxiety and concern and people feeling and like younger people feeling like there's no possibility for owning a house or whatever, any other number of issues. And to me, like, I do think that a lot of this has to do with capitalism. And I do think identity, like one place where maybe Jay and I will, well, actually we'll probably disagree, but maybe he'll at least um agree with me on finding like left-wing identity politics kind of bad. Is like, I think that's a distraction from the real sources of coercion and domination, which I think come from corporate power, corporate wealth. And I think the problem on the left for the Democratic Party is that it's been bought and paid for by a bunch of big corporate donors. And I think the same thing has traditionally happened on the right. And I would say continues to happen. I mean, I really don't think Trump is much, he's speaking the rhetoric of a kind of populism. But if you look like where is the money coming from, who are the people influencing things, it comes from corporate wealth and capitalists. And I think, other questions related to like white identity or identity politics, I think are a distraction from that. I also think, I'm going to be similarly critical of like the influence that Israel has, but also focusing on Israel and like not looking at it as a bigger structural problem with like corporate domination, and focusing on like Israel is also a distraction and mistaken. I think it's really like, I think this is beyond identity of like Judaism or whatever. It's a problem of money, and like who has the power to dominate and like continue to hoard for themselves. So I think a class based analysis could be a place where I am seeing, there are figures on the right who I may disagree with them on certain kinds of like moral and traditional views, but I think they have like economically, leftish ideas like Patrick Deneen, for example, and others, and I'm
RG
kind of
Green.
reading between the lines, Jay. Like maybe you have some sympathies to certain kinds of like left-wing redistributive policies. I'm not sure, but like it sounds like you are at least alluding to the fact that you no longer agree with sort of like the neoliberal right-wing or neoconservative consensus, which seems to be, but sometimes it's a little unclear when I hear like right-ish figures discussing these things, because then you also, I feel like you also said something that sort of sounded, oh, you talked about like zero sum, which I don't know. I mean, maybe there's a lot I could ask for clarification or expansion on, right? But like on that point, I was like, well, what do you mean by that? That sort of sounds maybe a bit like a neocon potentially, but I don't know. Again, I'm reading between the lines.
That was a specific point. What I meant to say is that you have two groups of people, one of whom want home values to continue to go up forever, one
Yeah.
one group of people who want them to go down.
Right.
That is a zero-sum game in that context, right?
Sure.
Economics more broadly is something
You're
different.
talking
I
about
just want to
boomers versus
clarify
everyone
that.
else, right?
Right. I see
Or
what
we
you're
could
saying.
consider legacy homeowners, people who have their homes paid off and are banking on that asset to pay for their lifestyle, versus people who are trying to house themselves.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was a. I just want to clarify.
Yeah,
that
fair
was
enough.
a specific, not a general statement.
Fair enough. Yeah. So I guess, and then I guess the last thing I would also say, which is more of like a kind of curiosity I have for Jay, and maybe a sort of commentary on like, I listened to your podcast you did about like defining the dissident right, and I've like kind of listened to a few other things of yours, not too much though, so I'm not like fully aware of the positions that you take, but sometimes, and maybe this is like would be unfair to apply to you, but sometimes I feel like sort of dissident right figures or online right figures, there can be a kind of evasiveness about like what they actually like believe, and like the evasiveness could take the form of like kind of focusing more on like grievances as opposed and like meta conversations, as opposed to just like what is it that like you see as, or people on the right see as like root problems and possible solutions, or the kind of memeing and joking, which I think it's wrong for pearl clutching left wingers to be like, oh my god, they actually, but at the same time I think like my critique of that kind of attitude is also that it contributes to kind of evasiveness. So it's not so much that I'm like horrified by the joke, but it's like, yeah, but like what do you mean, like where do you actually stand, right? Like the joke, it's not so much that the joke is some kind of, like I said, moral wrong, but it kind of contributes to a feeling that I have where I'm like, well, it's hard to tell where these figures actually stand on issues, right?
Yeah. So let's start off with capitalism more broadly, because I will pull a lot of my analysis on this front from James Burnham, particularly his book, The Managerial Revolution. And he makes the point that even in I believe he wrote this in the early 1940s, certainly during FDR's presidency. And his point was basically that capitalism no longer exists. While certainly there is, exploitation, his point is like, show me a capitalist. And his argument was joint stock ownership abolished that role, the capitalist. He used the example of Ford and he said, okay, yeah, sure, there's a guy named Ford who sits on the board of that company, but he doesn't really own it in the same way that his father did. He can't, like a monarchical figure, dictate. And so in my mind, it's part of the reason why I think that the kind of classic, Chicago school libertarian versus socialist economics no longer applies, is when we look at our system currently, it's like, well, what is it? Is it a capitalist system? Well, in some ways, yes. Is it a managed market system? Also kind of yes, in a way that's completely and totally, in my mind, the worst mix of both. So for instance, right, like you see this with the incredible level of subsidies and controls given to US agriculture and manufacturing, right? Corn is the classic example people talk about. It's like, well, okay, is it a ruthless capitalist system where if I paid for health insurance, it would be, 78% of my paycheck? Yes, that sucks. But is it like a true free market? Also, no. And so I say that not to carve out the like pick me position of like, well, actually it's neither, but to say that's why I'm not entirely sure that strict, Marxian class analysis necessarily applies. Because in my mind, that comes out of a specific period when an older existing feudal order was falling apart. and where the economy, in so much as it existed, was sort of the centralized manufacturing, or what's the term I'm looking for?
Yeah,
Industrialized economy.
not
I
to
don't
not
know if
to
that applies anymore.
not to like interrupt you, but I mean I have no problem with that. Like I'm not some kind of old school Marxist. I guess my point is more like, what is the like? It is a problem of distribution, I guess, is another way of putting it. Like I don't see this. Like I agree, things have changed, and you know the academic work that I do, like I'm in no way, could speak with authority about Marxism. But I guess it's more just broadly, like when we look at what are the problems, like why is it that like some people are just hoarding a bunch of resources, and then other people aren't? I think that like still some kind of class analysis, especially I guess compared to like what is our other method of analysis, and I guess other forms like identity, and I've always been a critic of identity politics on the left. I think it's a distraction from like where is the actual source of the problem. So that's fine. Like I'm totally open, and I have to be kind of an agnostic in a way about like how do we really understand our modern economy. Like I think it's complicated. I've taught Marx a little bit in school, and I know the basics, and I also understand some more kind of modern arguments that talk about how well it doesn't really fit. I'm totally fine like conceding all that, but I still think like, well, isn't it still a problem of distribution, however you want to define it, right? And a problem of like people feeling like they have the opportunity to live a life with enough resources to live securely. I mean, to be able to like raise a family with maybe only one parent working. I mean, that's an economic problem that's not possible, right?
Yeah, and real quick, because I want to get into white identity politics and what that means, but maybe to reframe that question or a point from Victor, in a way I am viewing it is like, we don't need identity politics. We don't need white identity politics. We don't need a lot of the things that are happening on the right if the economic problems were solved, right? Like if young white men could afford houses and could afford to start families, isn't that, from a Pareto distribution, just that's the problem that's causing 80% of the grievance? And shouldn't that be the lens that we focus on from an economic one versus a racial one? Or
yeah, well,
so look, and that's actually funny. I picked this up from a progressive who would be very upset if he knew that he taught me this idea. Fundamentally, all politics is identity politics. In that you were saying you were finding a group of people who have a common grievance or a common interest and motivating them to political action. Now, it depends, right, how we construct that identity. You could look at a union and say, well, certainly that is a common identity, albeit it is an economic one, a class-based one, even more specific than that, guys who have a job together. And look, like I'm not a race maximalist. I think race is a relevant factor, and I think that demographics in America are creating white identity politics. It is not necessarily required for that to be the case in all circumstances, right? Like imagine bringing like white identity politics to like England in the 19th century. It's like, what the fuck does this mean? It doesn't apply. But I will say, I think that when we talk about identity politics and carve it off from politics more generally, I think that that's a misnomer. Now, it is, I think, very valid to say, well, there are certain things we should and should not drag into the political realm, right? There are certain things we should consider outside of that. But the problem is, I don't necessarily think we, or the right, broadly speaking, is in a position to set the rules of that game. So for instance, right, in a multiracial society, and actually I'm going to pull a lot from Lee Kuan Yew, right, who talked about this. There's really, in my mind, only a few ways to govern a truly multiracial, multicultural society. You can adopt an imperial model like the Turks did, which certainly has its own problems, where you sort of have like an ethnarch. Family Guy transliterated this as the king of black people, right? Kind of a joke, but nonetheless, right? You can have that sort of representative system where each culture has its own sort of, I guess, like system inside an overarching one. Okay. You can have what they had in Singapore, which is this sort of like totalitarian state where everything is managed down to the level of like who lives on a block, who hires who, what language is spoken. They basically create, a whole society built around the English language as a lingua franca. Like you can do that. I don't see there either being the political appetite or the political ability to create that sort of state. Or, as Lee Kuan Yew said, the only things worth talking about in a multicultural society, absent those, are race and religion. That is what will come to the fore. And so that's sort of what I see happening. And yeah, sure, in an ideal sense, maybe class is a better tool of analysis. I'm willing to have that conversation. But the problem is, and this is a mechanism Bertrand de Juvenal uh, put out in, I think, a book from 48. I can't remember the exact title of it, but has been sort of abbreviated on the internet: high, low versus the middle, where he basically describes this mechanism where elites ally with the underclass to sort of fend off challenges from the middle. So in a feudal context, and this is kind of funny, right? Traditionally, the king was more popular with the peasants than their lord, right? He's far away. He can give them, a jubilee or whatever. It's not really his problem. Whereas the baron that lives in their town is oppressing them. And he would use that to sort of fend off rivals. Now, the problem is, and I think if we're talking about problems with liberalism, this is a great problem, is that they have effectively, and this is when we can both say like neoliberals, neoconservatives, whatever those people are, they have sort of opened the floodgates for a new underclass and are able to constantly replenish that and use that underclass exploitatively, right? It's not benefiting these people. And
who's the underclass?
You could say, like, in America, in a previous order, it would be kind of like, urban African Americans. But in this context, right, it's sort of new arrivals, people who are, poor and dispossessed and have been brought in and sort of exist on
like illegal immigrants.
Illegal immigrants. Yeah. You see the same thing in Europe. And they form an alliance there. Now, the alliance is not fair. It is effectively to keep the elite in power. But to me, the problem is that is a basic human political arrangement. It exists in many societies. But freedom of capital and freedom of labor have abolished the constraints which kept that relatively productive, that kept that relatively stable. And in my mind, that sort of free flow of labor and capital is ultimately the issue. And additionally, if we're talking about inequality, that also sort of frees them from the material constraints of how much can I get someone who lives here to work for, or how much does it cost for me to produce something. You are now able to, effectively increase the market to the entire globe. Your capital can go anywhere. You can live as effectively like you can rent seek in, India and collect the profits in Martha's Vineyard. And to me, like, that is certainly a problem. And is that a racial problem? Is that a class problem? It's like, well, both and. They're sort of synonymous. And even when we talk about like white identity, and I think that there's a level to which there is sort of an incipient white identity in MAGA, it is both race and class. You see that, when many progressives, especially wealthy ones, talk about whiteness, it's like, well, are they talking about them? No, they're talking about like a rich plumber in Dallas, a guy who's, in a different class, even if genetically he's somewhat similar. So sorry, Victor, that's a huge rant from me, but just several things I wanted to throw out.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the first thing I would say is it's like, it's a little hard to read between the lines, but I think I understood. Well, I'm not trying to say that there's like some hidden nefarious meaning in between the lines, by the way. I mean, I guess like on the race identity question, like I was thinking about this because Paul told me we were maybe going to talk about this. And I feel like, I mean, I think what Paul said, first of all, initially, I just agree with. I think that there's like a but for the economic disparity. I just don't think that people care that much about these things. But I do have an account like of human psychology that like maybe some conservatives would be sympathetic to, which is that I certainly think that it's natural for human beings to like notice differences and be like wary of them. We see this with liberals, with like NIMBYism, when they don't want like some building in their neighborhood to change. Like people like things to stay the same. And I think that that's where maybe like some racial like disagreements or whatever come up. But like maybe where and I don't know, I hope I'm not reading too much between the lines here, but like, I guess I feel like the form that takes, the form that kind of like fear of difference takes, I think is totally contingent on the circumstances. Like I don't think there's like a natural, and I think there's like some evidence to support that like racial, like feeling like race is a relevant factor of difference, I think is like learned as a child. I don't think it's natural. And you can find this if you go to like international schools, like these schools where kids from all over the world, that's actually where both a mutual hero of Paul and I's, Daryl Davis, he grew up in a school. I don't know if you know, if you're familiar with him. He's like, yeah,
Oh, Jay, yeah.
he grew up in an international school and didn't even understand what racism is. And we can even watch children like here in North America, and you can see them like it's just not a thing that they think about. Okay, so I think that like it's learned, and that I don't know if that's a place of disagreement for us, and ultimately like I just don't believe that if you have like economic security, social security, like you have like family ties, I think that all these other things about like race and like immigration, I think go away. In fact, there's some evidence. I wish I could cite the actual study, but I remember when I was doing my PhD, I was like studying this public policy class where we were looking at a bunch of different papers about, I think it was like employment policy and union policy, and it had to do with immigration and what this study. I mean, you know, you could find a study that supports anything. Like I want to concede that right away, but at least this one was interesting to me because it was like in, I think, sectors in Germany or some other European countries. It was like if the industry was doing well and they were hiring, like people started loving immigration because they felt like their industry was booming and they like needed more people. Okay, but then as soon as their industry wasn't doing so well, then they started worrying about immigration. So I think these things are directly tied to like economic security.
So
Yeah, so those, so I don't know if that's, yeah, so that those are, I guess, like where I sort of stand on this question of the relevance of white identity or identity in general. Like I think that ultimately, if you have economic and social security, like they just don't matter.
okay, real quick, because we'll hone in on this. It's so Jay. It sounds like basically white identity politics is necessary in reaction to the identity politics that came on the left, right? I mean, that's.
So
Is
I
that
don't even
basically
wanna
where you stand?
necessarily say necessary. Like I can completely take away any sort of moral tone we apply to this. I think it is inevitable because I think that that group of people is being, to adopt a framework from another camp, maybe is being othered, is being told you are a distinct group. And when
Okay,
someone
so
who,
sorry, just
sorry,
real quick. So then, because my whole thing is yes, if if the leftists cleaned up their own act and stopped playing identity politics and stopped going after white men. I did a video called "All My Beliefs the Left Would Shoot Me For," and one of them was there's far too many people on the left that hate white people. I think that's just true. Now, is it most? No. In what proportion of it? I'm not going to speculate, but there's too many. So if that got cleaned up, then the desire on the part of white men or white people or whatever to kind of identify with that in opposition, the inevitability would decrease, right? It's like, do you agree with that? Because I guess the point would be the dark centrist, path forward is get the left to clean up its crazies, and then the right will say, okay, we don't need to play this white identity bullshit because the left is cleaning up its, identity politics kind of nonsense that's starting a lot of this.
yeah, I mean, I definitely think there's something to that. I think fundamentally, I have a very different conception of race than Victor does. Uh, Skin color and race are kind of a gross term for what effectively is generic heritability of certain traits. In my mind, and you can actually look into the data on certain religious values, certain cultural values, they're extremely heritable. We're talking zero point 0.6 to zero point 0.7, which obviously is not everyone, but that is highly heritable, right? It just as much as IQ or height or anything else. So in my mind, that is there's a dramatic difference. And I believe culture and genetics are linked. You see this in, for instance, people have theorized about the relationship between something as stupid, right, as the way your body stores fat, which is relatively inconsequential, like Polynesians, right? If you tend to get on long boat rides with an uncertain food supply, you will select for people who can store calories long term, right? But to other things as well, those are dramatic differences. And let's accept the premise that this does not matter in times of economic surplus. All right, I don't buy that, but let's go with it. It seems to me to be extraordinarily unwise to build in fault lines into your society that will only appear when times are going badly. To basically say, well, it's fine now, but the moment where this surplus goes away, we're following that train of logic, we have less resources to deal with other problems. We have these existing fault lines, regardless of if those are legitimate fault lines or not. It seems to me that you are adding in an unnecessary level of, so we say, drag into the system. You're creating a potential problem. And, regardless of whether people should subdivide along these lines, in times of crisis, that seems to happen.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with you about that. But I actually think that, like I said before, the tendency for human beings to find division, I do think is natural. That's kind of where I'm. But it's just like the thing, like it doesn't matter. So like if it was all a white society and economic times are bad, they're going to find things to be divided on. Like we've seen that with Catholics and Protestants or whatever. We've seen that with all kinds of different subcategories. Like I just think that the race thing, like we're fallen humans, and it doesn't matter like how whatever we're going to find a way to be divided if times are bad. Like that's just, and I just don't think that it's going to make that much of a difference what that thing is.
I mean, I think that, yeah, sure, humans will find a way to enact politics one on another. But look at, for instance, right, the religious wars after the Reformation. Okay, yeah, do humans fight one and another? True, yeah, they do. But also, when you permit, and I say this as a Protestant, right? But when you permit that sort of challenge to the existing system, where all across a continent, which was still violent, right, during the Middle Ages, but was at least technically religiously unified, you permit an explosion of violence, right? The level of what is political grows. It is now not simply the kind of like petty squabbles between lords, but it is also, are you even a Christian? Are you a part of the same thing? And that's what, even within, people who are genetically very similar, who lived, dozens of miles away, right? Incomparably more similar to, any other group, across different continents. And so to my mind, it's true. Like, politics is human, division is human, but all things being equal, right, you would expect that the more significant, the more visually apparent as well, honestly, those differences are, the easier it is to, I guess, sort of promote bad behavior. Because look, like I can't look at you and say you're a Protestant or you're a Catholic. But, if we're visually very different, again, like that seems to be, let alone, right, the actual data on, multiracial societies, that seems to lead toward disorder.
So then, Jay, what is the practical like policy or political project that would come out of acknowledging this? Because, again, from my perspective, like let's hit the economic, to the degree that Marx was correct, which he was correct about some things. It's like, yes, we can look at the techno-feudal lens, say, okay, we've got the rich, ultra rich. There's a way to unify people along that. People will find division. Race is a vector on which people can find division easier. But then the solution should just be, well, let's just try to ensure our systems are set up such that the conditions never deteriorate to the point where people have to feel divided to begin with, right? Which would be sort of the economic populist kind of perspective. Well, if we have a strong social safety net, if we are able to do distributive wealth policies, we don't get to a point where humans can find division, even if it is easier along race, because people will still find division, British and Irish and Scottish and Protestants and Catholics and all that. So, yeah, what is, like, what are you advocating as a political project that would be different from just the economic populace?
Can I also just quickly
go ahead, Victor? Yeah,
because that's exactly pretty much the line of thought that I had. But I also sort of wanted to just add to that hypothetical question about like what is the right action to take here. I guess it just seems to me, and you'll answer us in a second about what you have in mind potentially, but because I guess in my mind I'm thinking, okay, well, on the one hand we could do what Paul just described. We could try to have like economic security redistributive policies that like try to minimize that possibility. But then on the other hand, like when you were kind of giving your account, you use this language of like, if we allow these, this mix, this, difference kind of to mix up, then we're setting ourselves up to potentially have this division in the future. But then I guess it seems to me, well, how do we prevent that from happening? Like now we're in, Canada or the United States. It's already mixed. So this we allowed it to happen. And then it's like one path is like we could just try to focus on economic redistribution and try to economic security, or we could try to disentangle people like that's where my mind's going, and that seems to me to be like far more like the downside of that. And the challenge of that seems like a lot more complicated to me.
Yeah. So several things, which is one, remigration is possible and popular, right? You have studies polls out of the UK saying it's just under 50%. It's something that can be done. Now, obviously, not everyone, you wouldn't want to do everyone, but this is something we've done before, right? American identity has gone through several stages, sort of like the numbered republics of France. You know, the initial, founding stock, then you have, you bring in, a lot of Irish and Germans. And, even within that, there was sort of a welding together of a unified identity. It used to be that people saw more in common with their state than their nation. We had a war about that. And then you have the creation of, holidays, even like Thanksgiving, to create a cohesive national identity. Now, really up until the frontier was closed, we had almost constant mass migration, right? Particularly from Europe. And now that changed. And we had basically 60 years in the front half of the 20th century where we had very little. And there was intense pressure to conform to a national culture. And so there is a process of ethnogenesis where ethnicity and race are not synonymous. Right? I might racially be English, but I don't give a fuck about, soccer or the Queen or whatever. I have a different ethnicity. And so I think it is possible to create a new ethnicity, but that takes time, and that requires effectively a closed garden. You have to say like, all right, we're going to let this cook until it can become a culture. And look, I'm not in love with the culture of the 1950s, not at all, but that was at least in some degree cohesive. There was a fellow feeling there. There were people who admittedly were quite, we could say ethnically diverse, but felt as if they were part of the same thing. And even then, there were huge differences between what were called the white ethnics, people who, again, are technically white, like the Irish, the Italians, the Croats, pick your poison. They saw themselves as being different from, white Anglo-Saxon America. And those differences were leveraged for politics for a generation. And it's really only recently that identity of white has really meant nearly as much as white people, again, that group, have become a minority. And I think that if we become a majority minority country, which is very likely, identity politics will become the way things are organized, simply because it's cynical and easy to get votes that way.
So, Jay, this is an argument for reducing immigration rates and securing our borders, which I 100% agree with. And, on the principle of if whites become a minority, white identity politics will inevitably arise. I agree with that, especially in the context
I don't think that's a good thing. I think there's a very real possibility that we end up with white Jesse Jackson, and I don't think that's a good thing.
Yeah,
but I think that is sort of the physics of the situation.
Okay, that's fair. Yeah, and so I agree. So a lot of my, when people my sympathies for the right, on a lot of cultural issues when it comes to race and stuff is like, I get when you see constantly white men sit down, shut the fuck up. The future is, non-white. We're taking your balls. It's like, okay, of course there's going to be a reactive response to that. And that's what creates the white identity kind of feeling. I agree. I don't think that's necessarily productive if it gets in the way of the more important kind of, I think, the deeper economic issues. But your point about, we had the moratorium on immigration in the early 20th century, so people could assimilate. I agree with that. I mean, my dark centrist compromise would be, look, people who've made it into the United States here, okay, fine, we're going to do a one-time amnesty thing, and then we're going to do a moratorium on the border because people can come here, they can assimilate, and then that's fine. But what do you mean by remigration? As in just deportation? Because I'm in favor of, if people came here in the last year or two, they broke the law, they haven't lived their whole life here. I think there's a case for those people to get deported, especially if they're committing crime. But what is remigration specifically that you're talking about?
Effectively, moving people back to where their ethnicities come from. We've seen this happen in Europe, right? Particularly after World War II. The conclusion was it is dangerous to have diaspora populations, that it creates a pretext for wars, for instance, as we saw with the German population. And look, was that done in an inhumane way? In some instances, yes. But the assumption was it's effectively better to take your medicine, right? To understand this is going to be messy, than create or allow, I guess, these sort of like fracture lines. And look, like there were certainly problems with that, but this is something that can be done. And in my mind, the idea that we can paper over these differences with economics, again, it's conceptually possible, but it seems to me that across the West, the general consensus is that things are going to get bad, right? The economy is not doing well. And if we're going to bet on that suddenly reversing, an abundance to sort of paper over these differences, I'm not convinced by that. I also want to say I think there's a very dramatic material difference between, as we saw in Europe in the 20th century, different European groups who, albeit very different, are ultimately within the same broad civilization. They were part of Christendom, for whatever that means, and people who have not only dramatically different, genetic makeup, but also dramatically different social arrangements, different assumptions of how a society ought to be built, different, I guess, kind of cultural assumptions. I think that is a much further gap to bridge.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little
Go ahead, Victor.
strange though, because like you're kind of saying, well, if the economy is going to get bad, well, then the action we should take is potentially do remigration. Why not just take the action and try to address economic issues instead, right? Like, so I don't like that part is, it sounds like you're either taking it as an inevitability and therefore the only way to deal with it is kind of like potentially this remigration, shut down the borders. That seems kind of unconvincing to me. But then, like, on this broader question of like borders, I mean, I think I'm kind of agnostic about like border policy. I'm certainly not someone who just thinks we have to have open borders for moral reasons. It's, to me, it's just like, well, what makes sense for like what we're trying to achieve at the time, right? Are there gaps in employment in places where we just like need immigration? Then I'm like, well, why would we shut it down if that's what we need? But again, that's not my specialty, so like I kind of have to remain agnostic about the economic effects of all that. But like, to me, I'm just like open to it if the argument makes sense. And then I guess like maybe just to also put some more of my own kind of like moral commitments on the table. I sometimes consider myself kind of like a Star Trek socialist in a certain sense. I sort of see, and it coheres with my own, to use a lefty term, lived experience. That, a world where people are just playing a function that suits their capacities well, and like their race or whatever doesn't matter, right? And in my experience, like living now, I live in Toronto, which is one of the most multicultural cities in the world, and like, are there problems? I mean, I guess there's some, but compared to most cities of its size, I mean, there's like incredibly low crime rates. It's working well. Like, so obviously that's just anecdotal evidence, but it's a giant city. And I don't know what the reasons are for that. I mean, compared to other comparable American cities, I mean, there's also obviously other reasons for why American cities have a lot of crime. But I mean, I guess if we compare Canada to the US, which Canada certainly has its problems, but I mean, like the stats are right there that crime's way lower in these cities. So like it can't, but it's just as, ethnically diverse, right? So it's like, well, is really the reason like a racial problem there, or is there maybe potentially some other economic reasons, maybe healthcare, right? I mean, having access to healthcare probably makes some sort of a difference. So those are kind of some of my reactions there.
And then real quick, maybe just to focus down, what does remigration look like, Jake? Because again, how does that differentiate from like deportation? There's a case for.
I mean, to be perfectly blunt, remigration is the idea that like, legal status is not the sole determinant factor. Like, hey, sorry, like, we can reinterpret birthright citizenship. We can look at, long-running policies that have been used to sort of demographically, reconstitute America and say like, hey, look, like, sorry, that was a bad idea. And sort of go from there. This
would be like someone.
Deport them.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, deporting people.
But you mean denaturalize? So people like, for example, if someone came from, some country in India or Congo or something like that. Their parents came here as immigrants legally. Then they had a kid, and that kid is now a 20-year-old adult. You're saying that that kid could potentially be
I mean, look, like
remigrated, deported?
that kid, who knows, right? But I'm saying is that a much more aggressive interpretation of who is and who is not considered an American. And this really comes down to a pretty fundamental, which is what is the purpose of a country? Is it to sort of create like an arbitrary, like economic super squad within one, broadly defined border, or is it to create a home for a people? And in my mind, I think that it is that sort of fellow feeling, that sort of genuine diversity is important, both in the community of nations and also to create a system in which people feel like they owe an obligation to those around them. So, for instance, right, when you live around the people you employ, there's an immense amount of data on this, also just anecdotally, the town I live in, for example, when you have something in common with them, there's an obligation. Whereas if your factory, or even as we saw in France pre-revolution, the economic engine which supported you is distant and far away, becomes ripe for exploitation. And so in my mind, a nation exists as a home for a people. And I think that, sure, there are definitely economic benefits. There are culinary benefits. And in, wealthy, economically productive areas, it is, not a huge drag to be a multicultural society. But I think that creates externalities which affect other people. So for instance, right, you could look at the way in which, many industries have basically become like foreign slave labor. You look at something like truck driving, which was a way for, working class men to raise themselves up in society. What was beneficial to capital to bring in people, right, from other places at, a cut rate. And in doing so, yeah, sure, it didn't necessarily make trucking always more dangerous, although that seems to have been the case. What it did do is cut off an opportunity for social advancement for people who were already here. And I think that is a real problem. And I think that in my mind, right, I think that the people who are coming here would be better off, to be honest, making their countries better. And we're creating this sort of reverse, I guess, kind of colonialism, this brain drain, where you're pulling the best and brightest from the third world, further immiserating those countries, and also creating a system where there is no or very limited possibility for advancement within the populations here. And so in my mind, right, I'm fully willing to accept the premise that restricting immigration, that working on a consolidated culture would create a poorer America. But in my mind, the point of America is not to be a maximally wealthy society. It's to be a place for Americans to live.
I agree. I agree with you about like the importance of having a feeling of community. I just think it's achievable cross-racially, cross-culturally. Like I feel like I see it in the city that I live in. But I do want to like just give that olive branch that I think that that's an important thing that like maybe some like left wingers don't talk about enough. They want to emphasize difference more than like, and that's actually why like I'm kind of a Star Trek socialist, because I look back at it and I see that they're all working to like a shared goal, and they have a kind of obviously not the more modern Star Trek. The more recent ones are like a little more woke, shall we say, but the ones back then where it was like you just had people of all races, colors, and it's like, but they never talked about it, right? They were never like, oh, like my whatever identity. They were just like, yeah, we're working to a shared goal. So like, I just feel that that's achievable. Like I said, I think from childhood, you see children, they talk to the kids, they talk to the black kid, they don't even notice it, they don't think about it. Like I think this is a learned category difference. Like the relevance of like blue eyes or hair color or whatever. Like I think that they become politically or socially relevant only for I think contingent reasons.
Well, I mean, let's look at the example of Canada. Like Canada has imported a large number of Indian people, as I understand it. Have those people integrated into Canadian society, or do people feel as if they are part of the same thing?
I mean, it varies, right? Like, obviously, I think there's going to be a difference between first generation versus second generation, right? I think the first generation is going to appear a little bit different. like, of course people are going to be a little bit wary, but is there like a huge spike in crime or like real social problems? Like, no, I haven't seen persuasive evidence to suggest that. But I'm also not going to like sit here and pretend that there isn't some. I mean, I would say like the main annoyance that comes to mind that people will maybe mention is, a lot of the kind of South Asian immigrants who end up being Uber drivers and they end up clogging the bike lanes with like delivery. That's like the one complaint I've ever heard that there's like, and they don't ring their bell. I'm a cyclist too, so I guess I noticed that they kind of zoom past me on their e-bikes without ringing their bell. But like, do I really see that as like a deeply racial problem or something that can't be like? It's just not on the top of my list of concerns such that I would be like, maybe we should start thinking about denaturalization. It's like, no, let's just like increase economic opportunities for everybody. I don't know. That's just kind of how I feel.
So two things there. One, I sort of reject crime rate as the sort of like sole relevant factor. I mean, look, like China has a very low crime rate. I don't particularly want to live there. So does a nursing home. So there are other factors as well, but like let's talk about this. So I have a friend. Have you talked to Kryptos before, Paul?
Who is it?
Kryptos. He's a Canadian guy. He primarily talks about a lull. He's a really interesting podcast guest.
Okay.
Completely irrelevant that detail, but I just wanted to know if you had any form of reference here. But he has children, right? I think his predominantly older teenagers to young adults. And one of the things that he has spoken about is the way that, and he is Canadian, that mass Indian immigration has hurt the job market primarily for young people. So, for instance, what happens is that we see certain chains, franchises in particular, sort of getting taken over by, we could consider like an ethnic bloc in the same way that Italians in New York got into garbage management, right? Because a guy who knows a guy, and you can sort of play that game, sort of presenting or playing identity politics as a recently arrived immigrant group, as they seem to want to do. And so what that has done is that his daughter is the sole young person at all, particularly Canadian, at Tim Hortons, right? That is a job that used to exist as kind of a step up as you entered the economy, and is now locked off to you. And so my point there is, one, that is an externality that is beyond, simple crime rate, a decrease in quality of life. But also, I think it's important to say, surrendering identity of politics requires mutual good faith. And I have a very hard time finding an ethnic group moving to America or elsewhere who exists as a punctuated minority, very different from the culture around them, who doesn't view themselves as an island, doesn't view themselves as a community. And so to my mind, identity politics, or an aversion to identity politics, is a privilege of being hegemonic culturally. It is a privilege of being the default. And when you are no longer in the default, when you see yourselves as in opposition to wider culture, identity politics becomes the sort of the nature of the day. I mean, look at the Black community in America, right? The Black community in Vietnam, who basically said, this isn't our war. Sure, they're Americans. At the time they had, full legal rights, and this is after the Civil Rights Act, but still they said, that isn't for me. That isn't my culture. And so to me, that would indicate over and over and over again that identity politics is sort of part of human nature. And obviously, there are people for whom that is an exception, particularly if there is, in our case, right, you see it in kind of upper middle class, effectively like white collar workers, where that culture sort of supersedes their, national or specific culture. But that is not true, one, at other social levels, and when we look at history outside of that context.
Yeah, on the first point though, real quick, I'm perfectly fine to concede. Like earlier, I said that I'm sort of an agnostic about immigration policy, in the sense that I just feel like I don't know enough to like have a firm grasp. But it seems like under Trudeau, he just like let in way too many people, like for economic reasons. And like what you're describing there is kind of like an economic issue, and I have no problem conceding and being like that was maybe a mistake. What I just would resist is more that it's having some kind of like social damage on society. I just I don't necessarily see that. And then on the point about identity politics, I mean, yeah, I guess I guess I just feel like our attention would be better spent. Like I think a lot of those grievances, I still think can be rooted in economics. So it just might be a place where we're gonna have to like agree to disagree. I just think that economics could address much of that. Like, of course, like I said at the beginning, human beings have a kind of attraction to sameness and comfort, and like I think that's never going to go away. But I also think that like what they respond to is contingent, like I said before. So
Yeah, that's fair. And we're coming up on an hour here, so we'll wrap this up very soon. But um,
I was wondering though, Paul. I mean, unless sorry if I don't want to. I was just kind of wondering about like how we think about left and right. I mean, I don't want to take over your show here, Paul,
sure. Well,
but that's something I've been wondering about.
all right, we can do it. We can do a mild extension, but just to put a kind of at least my thoughts on this. Yeah, like the Tim Hortons example you gave, Jay. It's like that's an economic example. However, I also see the point of like, well, there's this other here. These other people are coming in and they're, taking over jobs and excluding me out of economic opportunities. So that would be a both and type thing. And there are cultural differences. And I do think a big problem on the left is the idea, and I would say white working class, or excuse me, white collar liberals, and a lot of leftists have the idea of anyone can come in here and anyone can, it doesn't matter what your cultural background, we can all just exist so long as you abide by these economic rules. And I don't believe that. I believe that in the American context, Canada, I could take or leave. It's up to you, Victor. But in the American context, the American identity is largely a mimetic one. It's not necessarily a genetic one. There's people who came here originally, of course, that's fine. And I used to be less sympathetic to people who were like, oh, well, my parents were here on the Mayflower. And to be honest, that was just straight like liberal programming of like, well, colorblindness. You're not allowed to have your family with slave owners and all that, so it must be bad. It's like, no, you can have total pride if you're a heritage American or whatever you want to call it. But it's a mimetic identity. I think it's perfectly reasonable to want to preserve the character of that mimetic identity. But that's where the race thing comes in of like my barber, Oscar, who's Hispanic. It's like me and him are of the same mimetic tribe more so than me and a white European, certainly. And so like the nation state is one vector of like identity. The fact that we both live in the same city, like the racial one can't be, it is a balance. It's like you have to acknowledge that race is a real thing and people notice difference, like Victor said. I guess just the danger seems to be thinking that that's the vector that we can solve our problems, like with the remigration thing. It's like, well, if my Hispanic or Asian friend who grew up in this country and I'm friends with is now up for remigration, well, now it's my people that are being threatened. So it's sort of like, who's to say the white identitarianism runs the risk of, and I think often inevitably leads to, an arbitrary boundedness. Oh, well, because we're white, we have the same interests. It's like, but I have the same interests as my Hispanic and Asian friends I grew up with. Like, that's my people. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think that we wouldn't disagree there. Look, I'm not a white nationalist. I know a great many of them, but that's not my thing. And even look, like the origin of like white is fundamentally a product of the New World, right? That doesn't exist, really before the age of exploration. And it's even, let's be honest, a relatively recent export to Europe, right? Like it just did not apply until relatively recently. But I guess really fundamentally, this idea that we can transcend race, in my mind, is a very new idea. And I don't know if it's ever been done. And to me, the closest we ever got to that was sort of in my mind, either just before or just during the Obama era. That was a time in which, there was sort of a maximal amount of, post-racialism. And well, how long did that last? Right? Have we continued apace? Is America more or less racially divided than it was? And even then, the problem is, right, as Obama, who I think for many white people, they saw as a way to atone, a way to say, we don't care about this. It's no longer relevant. We did it, America. And that man, and whether you want to blame him personally or the physics of politics, was over and over and over again, returning to that wellspring, returning to say that it wasn't Freddie Gray. I think it was
Trayvon Martin.
He said this man could have been my son,
Trayvon
or when he
Martin.
referred to, I believe it was Romney voters as, white bitter hangers on clinging to their God and their guns. And you look at that and you're like, okay, well, like that always exists. That is a flaw in the system, that you can use that to exploit yourself into political power. And to me, unless we sort of abolish electoral politics writ large, which is one way to govern a multiracial society, not one I'm advocating for, that will always exist. That will always be there. And you're depending on people not to pick at that open wound, even aside the fact that, maybe not everyone, but a large number of people do view themselves distinct on racial and cultural lines. And that is a way to power. So sorry, not to just monopolize the conversation.
No. That clarifies things.
Also, I would just add real quick that, I've read some somewhat persuasive historical accounts that show that ancient Rome, like the Roman Empire, really didn't think about race like the way that we do. And I think there'd be people who'd be promoted who were like from Northern Africa and would end up being generals, like in England, in what would have been called Londinium back then, right? And like,
yeah, which again is that imperial model. But
yeah, right. So I agree. I was actually about to say that next. Like that is the imperial model. But I think maybe it's feeling like you're part of something greater, which is of course the thing that Mussolini wanted to kind of recreate in a sense. Which is why it's interesting. He's kind of like his original writings were I wouldn't say anti-racist, but very uninterested in like the
post-racial fascism.
Baby. Yeah, post-racial.
Well, like genuinely, and this is sort of what we were talking about earlier, but like Mussolini is sort of an odd synthesis of right and left there. Like he very much did pull from kind of his early career as a socialist, which I think is sort of interesting.
Yeah.
So
Paul, if you want, we can wrap up. But
I was just saying we're at an hour. Do you just want to raise a question, or I guess what do you?
Well,
we can go for 10 or 15 more minutes if that works for you guys.
It's fine with me. I suppose okay. I was curious about how we think about like left and right, because I think this can be kind of tricky. And I don't know if either of you have read George Lakoff, but I've always found his account of moral politics to be like in a way the most convincing way of thinking about like right versus left as a kind of moral orientation based on a family metaphor. So like just really briefly, like when he's talking about like the kind of conservative worldview, he says that it's organized around kind of the metaphor of the strict father, right? So for example, it'd be like, and the basic idea is like the world's a dangerous place. People are inherently self-interested, moral characters built through discipline and self-reliance, right? And then you kind of have like a core kind of moral logic of like authority to order, social hierarchies reflect a natural order, right? Like people must learn from wrong primarily through punishment, right? Self-reliance, moral desert, those who succeed earned it. Redistribution is immoral because it rewards failure. And obviously the policy implications, it's, kind of like small welfare state, strong police, military, border enforcement. And then you have kind of like the other metaphor, the more like left-wing metaphor, which is the nurturant parent or the nurturant mother, right? So the world contains opportunity. People are imperfect, but improvable. Moral character develops through empathy and mutual support. So here, like the core moral logic is like care, moral action prioritizes reducing harm and supporting flourishing. Mutual responsibility. We owe each other support because everyone is vulnerable. Freedom as capability. So social programs expand real freedom by enabling people to develop. Restorative justice. Crime reflects social conditions or economic conditions, as we've been talking about. Justice aims at repair. Open inquiry, right? Expertise, science, and deliberation help us care. So, and like obviously this implies universal health care, welfare programs, rehabilitation over punishment, equality as a social project. So I guess the reason I raise this is because I do feel like it puts its thumb on something more intuitive than just saying like left versus right. It's like a bit more specific, and it's kind of like a kind of a good description of an almost emotional orientation to like how we think about the world. But also, like, interestingly, I felt like sometimes when you were talking, Jay, you were maybe picking up parts from some of both of those. And I was just really curious about like, how do you see yourself? Like when I describe those things, do you recognize one? Like, I very much recognize myself on the liberal progressive orientation. Like, I very much, I'm like, yeah, that's the world. And like, of course, there could be some places where that goes to excess, where like some form of discipline is important, but ultimately, like when it comes to policy implications, I just feel like that should be the goal.
Yeah. So, and I don't want to be, I don't want to be overly punitive here, which is one, just, and maybe this is a more of a personal thing. This is actually what Paul and I spoke about in our first discussion. Uh, I, and this is related to, in my mind, the distinction between right and left. I feel no need to be consistent in application of politics. Like in my mind, it's like, yeah, sure, I want welfare for my people. For other people, I'm not going to. Why would I? And that comes down to, in my mind, the distinction between right and left, which we can look at is either, hierarchy versus equality, or in my mind, discrimination. Right? The idea that, and I don't mean that in a punitive sense, to use that word second time in one paragraph, but like
I
the
got it.
idea that there are things that I prefer over others. So, for instance, when I say my wife, I prefer her over other women. She means more to me. She has more of a sacred value. And so, in my mind, that sort of moral orientation, which is who do you owe a responsibility to? Who do you take care of? Is in my mind in group focused. And while as a Christian, there is a generalized obligation to humanity writ large, maybe this comes down to a fundamentally limited view of what human society can accomplish and also uh, where our priorities should be found. But in my mind, that sort of privileging of mine over yours is the basis of morality. And I don't view that to be illegitimate. And my view of equality is that is ultimately a flattening and homogenizing force that attempts to turn man into sort of an interchangeable widget against his own nature. And so, for instance, in the example of restorative justice or many of these welfare programs, in my mind, we have run that playbook for the last century, and it has not in any meaningful way decreased inequality, has not decreased the social gap between the richest and the poorest. And so in my mind, I view that as a failed project.
I mean, I strongly disagree that anything resembling that has been tried. I mean, like in the U.S., there's places, and I know I can already anticipate your response when I bring up Norway's prison system is going to be like, well, they're a homogenous society, so they're different. I know the talking point there. But what's striking to me in that case is that they really did have very high recidivism rates beforehand, right? When it was whatever a homogenous society, and this had a dramatic impact on reducing that. And I don't know if you're aware of that system. Maybe you probably are.
Yeah, well, and my point would be like again, that goes back to like, you can do leftism for, or you can do a social program for your people, right? For people who are on the same page culturally, who have that sort of fellow feeling, who see themselves as part of the same thing. But when that becomes for everyone, open to the world, that system sort of falls apart. And in my mind, right, like the prison system, the whatever you want to call that, the combination of prison and welfare, has sort of been enabled by racial division in the U.S. Like on one hand, white terror over black crime, and also effectively, black in-group preference and disdain for hegemonic white culture. And so like, look, like I don't disagree with you that, there are certain times in which, more restorative justice or, certain social policies are, justified, are, in many cases productive. There were, certain instances in Italy and Germany where this was, proven to be the case, but it depends on, in my mind, a unified culture. And yeah, maybe again, this is a place where you have to agree to disagree.
Yeah.
But in my
And to
mind,
me, it's just like, but it clearly just hasn't been tried. Like, right. So, to make the claim, well, we tried and it's been a failure. Like, no, like there's nothing like Norwegian prison system that's been tried. I mean, you can say now, like, I think it's going to fail because we're not homogenous enough, but let's try.
I mean, in my mind, I think it's important to contextualize the sort of mass incarceration of the 1990s in America as a response to an incredible liberalization of police culture, of sentencing that happened in the 60s and 70s. And so in my mind, yeah, sure, it was not as good as Norway, but we have tried. I mean, even look at places like the Pacific Northwest, Portugal, where there was a desire to decriminalize, a desire to decriminalize open air drug use, and the general consensus, those places have pulled back. I went to Portland recently, and they had recriminalized. The idea was we attempted that with a robust safety net, and it didn't work. And so we can quibble, and I realize we're fast approaching time, but in my and this may be that you and I come from fundamentally different moral perspectives on the world, which I think is the case.
It's clearly the case, and I think and I also don't want to get into a debate about empirical data, right? Like I think I've maybe 100%. Seen different data than you've seen. I agree with you though that I have to concede that some of these like experiments with just pure decriminalization have not really worked, but I think that that's because there wasn't enough corresponding treatment and social programs to go along with it. But just kind of like allowing people to do drugs and then not having any plan for them to get off it was a really stupid idea, and they've done it. And so I totally can see that. But yeah, if you want, Paul, we can end. I did kind of have one more thing that I was really curious about, but if you want to cut me off.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Okay, I was mentioning this to you. I mean, I don't know, maybe this is going to open up too long of a conversation, but I was mentioning to you, Paul, that I had this list that I've been thinking about of like things that I call the barbarisms of America. And there's like 5 of them. And like from coming from a Canadian perspective, but basically the idea is I think these are 5 things that like the rest of the developed world, the advanced economies, look at America and are just like, what the fuck are you guys doing over there?
All right, I will allow some anti-American slander to end.
Okay, so and I would love to, and there's 5, but then there's also 4 honorable mentions. But I think the 5 are healthcare, death penalty, mass incarceration. Right. Like, I mean, as a percentage of the population, it's actually insane. Like, I think the next highest is 5 times lower by per capita. Guns. It's
those
fine.
Are connected.
Those are guns. And then the 5th one is gerrymandering, which is an insane thing that like every other country in the world is like, when I remember explaining this to European and they were like, wait, excuse me, like the politicians get to decide.
Yeah,
the
congressional
lines.
Districts make no sense.
That is
they have no mapping onto real community. It's
that
just
is an absolute insane thing. And then just quickly, the honorable mentions, lack of paid family leave. I mean, this is an insane thing that every other country in the world has. And I think like that's something the left and right could also unify on. Like I think the left does not talk nearly enough about like the importance of the family and like supporting the family. And I think a lot of that is like an giving economic capability to families. Another one is like public education funding, which is also insane in the States, where it's like by local property taxes, but then it's like only hoarded by that one locality.
Yep.
So like you live it. I mean, that is like the most lack of equality of opportunity, the most blatant, egregious form of like destroying equality of opportunity. Because if you grow up in a poor school, you're going to get a way poorer. And that isn't, I mean, in Canada, it's also funded by local property taxes, but then it's pooled and distributed based on need to all the schools, right? Public transit funding also, I would say. And then the last one is more of just a lull, is lack of metric system. I think you guys are barbarians over there without
actually.
Oh my God.
The metric system.
Now we're going to really disagree.
That's just an honorable
mention. The graying of the world. I want to go to a country where the local units are completely incomprehensible. Like I want to go to Ireland and have a man tell me that something is like 14 potato fields away, be completely baffled. That's a different country.
That's fair. Celsius, so man, 0, where water freezes. It's just logical.
No. 0 is really cold. 100 is really hot. That's Fahrenheit. 0 is pretty cold. 100 is the destruction of the atmosphere. It's 212
What
degrees.
is freezing point in Fahrenheit? Like 24?
32. It's so easy.
Hell if I know. We need to make these more arbitrary. I want to live in a world of human distinction.
That's fair.
I think that they should be completely and totally made up.
You love how they say like 12, you weigh 12 stone. They have that weird thing in it.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think many of those complaints are valid. I mean, I think that America has been turned into a corporate bordello. I think that many of the things that you were talking about when we say the developed world effectively exist as an extension of American imperial policy, that we rule the world. And the deal we offer is basically, hey, we handle your security concerns for you. And so particularly in Europe, a lot of generous social policies have sort of been funded based off of the fact that many of those countries aren't really real sovereign nations anymore. They don't really have armies. They don't get to decide their own foreign policy. They're satraps in our empire. And the advantage to that is you can fund large welfare programs. I think it would be great if America had a much better welfare program. To be honest, like I do. But look, like the American empire is not run for the benefit of American citizens like me. Like, yeah, 100%. Like that sucks. Many of those things suck. I think our inclinations on crime and punishment are dramatically different. To be honest, like the death penalty was incredibly effective at reducing crime in Europe over, hundreds of years. I think that ultimately, and I know this is a dirty word, it is a eugenic thing. Massive discussion for another day. I feel quite strongly about the death penalty. But when we look at that list of issues, largely I find myself in agreement. There are obviously things I don't.
A death penalty, by the way, like you could convince me that it reduces crime. I just think it's wrong. Like it's like a moral wrong. Like I'm not even a Christian, but I just think like a country putting a citizen to death is just wrong.
Oh, see, I read Foucault and I was like, that's rad.
Sorry, Paul.
More of that.
No. All good. All good.
Paul, do you have any quick reactions to that? I'd love to know what you think.
No, I agree. The property taxes one is my go-to. Like, this is the dumbest system we've ever created. Education's supposed to be the great equalizer for everyone, and this is the opposite of that. Right. The argument is a lot of poor schools will get a lot of funding, and it still doesn't improve outcomes, so it's not necessarily.
It's also because you guys have a unique system where, like, your power is so diffused to the locality, where like I feel like the American political system, and maybe Americans in a certain sense, are almost allergic to like to centralism, right? Where it's like, oh no, like this is our stuff. This is
I agree. I think it should be vouchers. I think it should the money should go up to the federal government, distributed as vouchers. Hold on. We can get into a whole education. That'll be a future thing. What I'll say is as conclusion, I think you guys are right. Obviously, you guys both. It's so funny you brought up the George Lakoff thing. I love George Lakoff. Strict father, nurturing parent. I think you both, Jay's on the strict father side. You're on the nurturing mother side. The great dark centrist irony is that man and woman must be joined in flesh, and become a union, and that's the ideal thing. So you need both. So, the thing I'm going to reflect on going forward is, okay, well, what are the areas? If we could come up with a 3-point plan that all three of us agree on, what would that be that's most practical in terms of like, okay, well, maybe it's property taxes, maybe it's, a lot of it would be economic, because the areas where there is disagreement of, well, the racial component is not as eradicable as Victor might thinks. So then what progress can be made in the areas we agree on that, even though there's a fundamental kind of moral difference there. And that's something that
I feel like one that we could probably agree on, and obviously this is different contextualized, is that there are any number of industries that need to be smashed, right? That operate as cartels. I mean, even look at the internet, right? Look at the companies that control it. And, you could look at someone like Teddy Roosevelt, who's sort of, again, this bizarre populist figure who went around trust busting. I think that's a good thing. Whether we apply that to social media, to, any other number of industries, I think that should be done.
Nina Khan was doing kind of a good job on the antitrust, I think. Yeah. And I know that some conservatives, some kind of like dissident conservative thinkers have agreed with that, I think.
Yeah, she was on the All In podcast not too long ago, and I think they were speaking positively of her. I could be wrong, or they were shitting on her prior to that. But trust busting, breaking up corporate power, techno-feudalism.
We can agree on that, I guess.
We can agree on that. Yeah. All right. Thank you very much to both of you. I appreciate it.
Thanks for allowing me to indulge my additional topics.
Anti-American slander.